Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Huelsman. I'm the Associate Director of Policy and Research at Demos. For those who are unfamiliar with Demos, we're a public policy organization working for an America where everyone has an equal say in our democracy and an equal chance in our economy. And I wanted to start my remarks today with some basic questions that I think are informing they inform the politics of every generation, but they seem particularly acute in this current political moment and what are going to just decide the sort of future of our politics. One is basic questions about who belongs here, whose voice has power in our politics. What do we owe each other? What do we owe future generations, frankly? And how does that manifest itself in our politics? How do we react when things go awry in our economy, our democracy, in the world? And then what does a successful economy look like? What are the metrics we use to determine whether things are going well for people out there? And given the changing diversity of America that we've talked about a few times this morning, there's actually this sort of pitched battle going on to determine whether or not a multicultural society and a multicultural democracy is something to fear, fight, contest, or mitigate, or whether it's the fulfillment of the very promise that we've set out for ourselves as a country. We're sort of choosing between competition, this vision of competition between each other, and solidarity, or others, or us. And I would argue that this argument, and actually the answers to it, requires a much better understanding than we currently have in our media, our politics, our civic life, about who America is and what America looks like. So here's a quick thought experiment. What's the first image that pops into your head when I say the words working class? Everyone got something in their head, generally? For many of you, it's probably something like this. Yep, see, I heard, every time I do this, people are like, yeah, that's right. It's a great picture, too. It's someone who works in manufacturing, maybe sort of resource extraction, a trade, something like that. It's usually a man. But what if I told you that this is actually a much better representation of today's working class? And when I'm defining working class, I'm talking about those earners in the labor market without a college degree, those in lower wage jobs, or those that actually simply define themselves, self-identify as working class. It's someone who's likely to be a home healthcare aide, a cashier, retail worker, working in a job that serves people as opposed to making things. She is much more likely to be brown or black. She is much more likely to be a she. In our original version, the image that popped into your head isn't necessarily wrong, it's just kind of outdated. In 1970, the working class, in fact, this graph is actually defining those in the labor market without a college degree, the working class was 90% white. Today, it's nearly half non-white. And why does this matter, right? This matters because this outdated view is reflected back at us in our politics. And if you're going to read one book about this, I recommend the book Sleeping Giant by my friend and colleague Tamara Drought. She shaped a lot of my thinking on this. And I want to sort of like move to sort of the narrative, right? So think about all the hand-wringing after the 2016 election and the run-up to the midterms in a few short weeks. There's no shortage of commentary, frankly, about how President Trump has won over working-class voters, how maybe Democrats are struggling to connect with the working class, how the forgotten man, and it's almost always a man, deserves special attention in an economy and a democracy that has left him, it's almost always a him, and his voice behind. But is that actually true? If we define working class as those who are struggling to make ends meet in our economy, that are working but struggling, we actually find kind of a different story. And this is just one metric, but the job approval of our current president is actually lowest among those bringing in less than $2,000 a month. It's much higher, or relatively speaking, among upper middle class families and the wealthy. And these assumptions about who the working class is and what they believe in and what their politics are sort of drive political strategy. It drives campaign strategy. It affects who gets listened to. It affects who has a voice. It affects who's reflected in our politics, and reflects among us who we feel fundamentally aligned with. And of course it affects public policy. Now, I come from the world of higher education policy. I've worked on it most of my career. And this is just one example of why defining ourselves matters. Americans pretty much of all political stripes generally agree that education, going to college, going to high school is a good thing. We want it for ourselves, particularly in our families. But over the last 4 decades, we've seen states cut higher education budgets just as demand has surged for college going, right? And your reaction to that sort of fact and that dynamic and your willingness to mobilize around that is really dependent on your assumption of who is affected by that. So think back to the thought experiment I did about the working class, right? And do the same for college student. what do you think of when you think of college student? I don't have a picture up there, but if you think of the typical college student in America as younger, middle class or wealthier, right out of high school, going to a four-year college, living on campus, maybe partying too much, you may feel one way about sort of like a disinvestment in public higher education. But if you understand that almost half of all college students are at community colleges or trade schools, if you understand that they're not likely to live on campus but commute, if you understand that a full quarter of college students have kids of their own, you might feel differently, right? You might begin to recognize that cuts to public services, for example, impact not just you and your family, but sort of people across age, across race, and across geography. So it matters, it shows up in public policy. Defining who we are also requires us to discuss race head on. That's an elephant in the room often, but if we've learned something from the last few years, and sort of the entirety of our history, it's that race is an incredibly powerful force in our politics. And one way it sort of manifests itself, or that race is deployed in our politics, is through this sort of like narrative that associates racial fears with a threat to people's economic livelihood, linking government sort of among the two, this sort of vicious cycle that associates government, either sort of its effectiveness or lack thereof, and who it's serving with others, right, sort of to divide us. And this tweet actually is kind of the platonic ideal of how this works. This tweet actually by our president others people from Latin America, but it also actually attacks the efficacy and the sort of motivations of government, sort of keeping, or the lack of a border wall in this case, right, keeps people who bring crime, drugs into our country. That sounds bad. It also allows the undeserving, it's unsaid, but goes to go on the federal dole. So this is sort of like how this works in practice sometimes. It's also a really efficient piece of messaging, right? It sets up a hero and a villain generally. It outlines both a problem and a solution. It's an action item embedded in there, which is like read this study or read this tweet from Fox News. But it also has embedded in it a lot of assumptions that are hard to break about who we are as Americans, about what immigrants look like, frankly, about what value they have, about an innate competition in American society, and again, who the government is and should be looking out for. And there's a debate about how to counteract this, right? Or how to sort of like, maybe mitigate this, or what should be the response to something like this. And it happens on the left, right, where folks talk about whether we need to focus on sort of an economic populism first, or whether identity politics is sort of a the best way forward, as if those things are mutually exclusive. And I want to very briefly touch on that there might be another way to do that those things actually are mutually exclusive. So my colleagues at Demos, in partnership with Anat Shenker-Osorio and Ian Haney-Lopez, have undertaken what I think is a really interesting research project that we're calling the race-class narrative, which has tested a number of messages that involve sort of racial scapegoating, colorblind economic populism, some traditional messages, and then a narrative that addresses both race and class and serves to count as sort of a counter to like kind of the divide and distract politics that we often use, and it sort of offers another view of race as a way that can be deployed in our politics. And they've actually found that a successful narrative involves calling out ways that we are divided against each other. And by the way, division, just like the simple like increase in division in our politics, is one of the reasons that many tune out of politics altogether. So sort of calling it out and saying that you are being sort of led to be divided actually sort of sparks a light bulb in folks. But it also involves forging mutual economic bonds with each other, finding the power levels and levers rather, and ways to organize around them. And when it talks about government, it talks about a government that works for all of us. When it critiques government, it talks about a government that isn't working for everyone, right? An understanding that maintaining public commitments sort of helps all of us in some way, sort of building up our notion of the public good. Think back to the sort of higher education example that I brought forth. A narrative around sort of talking about a public good would say that higher education budgets sort of cutting them hurts those going to night school. It cuts night school classes. It increases student debt. It hurts old people. It hurts young people. Things like that. It also involves discussing race openly, because particularly persuadable Americans have very complex feelings about race, and staying silent about race actually sort of allows, without a counter narrative, allows the dog whistling and the bullhorning to sort of go unchecked. So I'm not going to go through the message that worked here, because I think I'm sort of over time. here, but I think we have a bunch of sort of ways narrative can work that sort of discuss sort of inclusion, that discuss how we're all in it together, that actually names racial scapegoating as a weapon that economically, frankly, harms all of us and destroys our civic life, and emphasizes unity and collective action. So the very, very last thing I want to do is do one quick analogy, which is imagine you are boarding an airplane. For many of you who traveled here, it might be the plane you're taking home from here. Now you get on the plane, and people are boarding, and you think there's a good chance you have an entire row to yourself, right? It's a miracle, right? But soon, a bunch of people show up, and it's a full flight, sorry, because of course it is, right? And be honest with yourself. In that moment, you're kind of annoyed. You're annoyed at things. You're annoyed at something. You didn't pay for the whole row. You didn't you don't have a right to the whole row. The seat next to you isn't yours, but you kind of thought it was, right? Just for a second there. And we know that sort of the lesson I'm saying here is that equity to someone with a sense of privilege does feel like loss. So you have a couple options here, right? You could spend the flight being annoyed at your seatmate when they do that weird like armrest dance. You could be annoyed, when they get up to go to the bathroom. You're just sort of like annoyed the whole flight, whatever. Or what you could do is you could achieve cross-airplane solidarity with each other and realize that many of the reasons you're annoyed are structural. It's that airlines are constantly making your seat smaller, increasing prices and fees, overbooking planes, getting rid of meals, making you pay for bags, overworking and underpaying the flight attendants who are then less responsive to you, lobbying to create more corporate concentration so there are fewer airlines to fly in the first place, and making life just a little bit worse for all of you except for maybe first-class passengers. So if enough people sort of change our... It's amazing if you there are a few institutions that you can continually crap on, and airlines is one of them, and people just but it's true. So what does that tell us? This is really hard, right? Changing that frame is really hard. But it starts by sort of organizing around shared fate, framing problems in the collective as opposed to the individual, understanding, that avoiding race doesn't mean it goes away, but that someone else's take on it may win. And it involves, like I said, framing solutions in the collective and telling a story about what it means when we're doing well, having a conversation about what we owe each other and something that works for all of us. And frankly, it involves combating cynicism a little bit and seriously interrogating and talking about the times we've come together to tackle big things and make life better for as many people as possible. So, thank you.